If you listen closely, ancient history doesn't begin with kings. It begins with water, with mud, with hands pressing seed into soil, hoping the river will be kind this year. For thousands of years, the cities between the rivers fought and rose and fell, each one believing it could stand alone. And then, one day, someone tried something the world had never seen before. Not just conquest, but a new shape of power, an empire. Before we begin, if this kind of slow, quiet history helps you relax, consider subscribing. It really helps a new channel grow, and it helps you find your way back here again. And if you feel like it, leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are right now. I read every comment. I like them, and I'm always glad to see them. Now, let's return to the world before empires. Before empires, there was land. Between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the earth lay open and generous. Each year, the waters spilled beyond their banks, slow and heavy, spreading across the plain. The soil darkened beneath the flood, softening, breathing, waiting. Mud clung to bare feet. Reeds bent under the weight of water. The air carried the smell of wet earth and grain, thick and familiar. Here, seeds took root easily. Dates ripened beneath long, patient sunlight. Sheep moved slowly along narrow canals, their bells echoing faintly across the fields. From water and soil, life returned again and again, steady, dependable, repeating itself without hurry. People gathered where the land was kind. At first, they built lightly, shelters of reed and clay, fires that burned low at night. Over time, these gatherings lingered. Paths formed between homes. Storage rooms grew heavier with grain. Shrines rose where offerings were placed. Villages became towns. Towns swelled into cities. Their walls rose slowly, brick by brick, baked from clay and patience. Hands pressed wet earth into moulds, set them beneath the sun, and waited. Each brick carried the time it took to harden. Each wall marked a promise of safety. Names like Uruk, Lagash, and Kish carried weight, spoken with pride, remembered with reverence. These were not small places. They were crowded and loud, filled with ambition. Streets pressed close with traders and priests, soldiers and labourers. Donkeys groaned beneath loads of grain and pottery. Voices overlapped in markets thick with dust and heat. Smoke from hearth fires drifted upward, mingling with prayers offered to unseen powers above. Yet for all their abundance, these cities stood alone. Each belonged to itself. Each answered only to its own ruler and bowed only to its own god. A city's strength ended at its walls. Beyond them lay other gods, other laws, other ambitions. A deity. Honoured in one place was a stranger beyond its borders. Favour was local. Protection was limited. What lay outside was uncertain and often hostile. So war became familiar. Not the kind remembered with pride for generations, but the kind that returned again and again like a seasonal flood. Borders shifted with the years. Alliances formed, held briefly, then quietly dissolved. Victories were celebrated beneath banners and drums, only to be undone a few seasons later. A defeated city paid tribute, waited, recovered, and rebelled. No peace lasted long enough to feel permanent. Power passed from hand to hand, never settling, never resting. In the fields outside one such city, a farmer bent over his work. The soil felt the same beneath his fingers as it always had. Cool, heavy, alive. He pressed seeds into the earth and covered them gently. The river still flowed. The crop still needed tending. Yet the banners on the walls changed. 1 year, soldiers marched in beneath a new emblem, Another year, different men claimed authority, speaking new names for old orders. Taxes shifted, measures changed, prayers were adjusted, spoken carefully now, in case the gods listening had changed as well. The rhythm of labour did not. For people like him, rulers came and went like storms, loud, disruptive and temporary. They arrived with demands and promises and left behind scars in the fields and stories at the fire. Kings spoke of destiny and divine favour, but their reach was short. A city might dominate its neighbours for a time, forcing submission through strength or fear. But strength faded. Fear loosened. Another city rose. Another king claimed supremacy. Nothing held. Nothing endured. This was the rhythm of the land. Competition without conclusion. Ambition without resolution. Beneath it all lay a deeper truth, understood but rarely spoken. Rule was fragile. Authority depended on constant effort, on walls that did not crumble, soldiers who did not desert, gods who did not turn away. A single defeat could unravel decades of control. A single famine could empty both storehouses and faith. The world accepted this instability as natural. Power, like the rivers, moved where it wished. No one expected permanence. No one imagined unity beyond temporary dominance. The idea itself felt unnatural, almost dangerous. And yet, as cities grew richer and conflicts more destructive, a quiet question began to take shape. Not in temples, not in palaces, but in the shared exhaustion of endless struggle. What if this chaos was not inevitable? What if the rivers did not need to divide but could connect? What if the cities did not have to compete forever? What if strength could be organized, not just displayed? What if authority could outlast the lifetime of a single ruler? What if one man ruled them all? It was a dangerous thought, a disruptive one. It challenged tradition, belief, and the fragile balance maintained through rivalry. To imagine a single ruler over many cities was to imagine something entirely new, a power not bound to one god, one wall or one name. Empire was not yet a reality. It had no shape, no rules, no language. It didn't exist in law or memory. It was not part of the natural order of the world between the rivers. But like all inventions, it began first as an idea. And ideas, once born, do not remain still. They drift, they linger, they wait. And eventually they find someone willing to carry them forward. Long before his name carried power, before it echoed across cities and carved itself into memory, Sargon existed only as a story, whispered at the edges of history. It begins, as many ancient stories do, with a child in a river. The tale says the child was born in secrecy. His mother, unable to keep him, wove a small basket from reeds and sealed it with pitch so the water could not reach him. At the river's edge, with no ceremony and no witnesses, she set the basket upon the current and let it drift away. The water took the child, rocking him gently as it carried him forward, away from his beginning and towards something unknown. The river, which had taken so many lives before, did not take this one. Instead, the basket caught among reeds near the shore. There, a gardener found it while tending the land. He paused, listening to the water, uncertain at first whether what he heard was real. When he lifted the basket, he found the child inside, silent, wide-eyed, alive. Without question, he carried the infant home. The boy grew among orchards and canals, beneath open skies and changing seasons. He learned the rhythms of planting and harvest, of waiting and care. He was not raised in a palace. No tutors spoke to him of kingship. His hands knew soil long before they would ever touch a weapon or a seal. This is the story as it was told. Whether it happened exactly this way is something history can never fully answer. But the truth of the story lies not in its accuracy, but in its meaning. Ancient people did not tell such tales by accident. They shaped them carefully, preserving them because they explained something deeper than facts ever could. They believed destiny revealed itself early, that greatness left signs, that the gods marked certain lives from the very beginning. A child cast into the river and spared by it was not ordinary. The river was sacred, dangerous, and powerful. To survive its currents was to be chosen. To rise from it was to be claimed by fate itself. By telling Sargon's story this way, people were not simply describing his birth. They were explaining his future. In a world where kings inherited power and bloodlines defined authority, Sargon's origin stood apart. He was not born into royalty. He did not belong to an ancient family of rulers. He rose from obscurity, from anonymity, from the margins of society. That alone made his story compelling and unsettling. Because if greatness could emerge from nowhere, then the world was less predictable than people wanted to believe. To the gardener who raised him, Sargon was simply another mouth to feed, another pair of hands learning to work the land. Days passed quietly. Seasons turned. The boy grew taller, stronger, more observant. He spoke little. He watched carefully. The movement of people, the way authority shifted even within small spaces, the way some voices carried weight while others did not. Later generations would say that even then destiny was shaping him. But destiny, in truth, is only visible in hindsight. What mattered was that Sargon learned life without privilege. He understood labour. He understood dependence. He understood how fragile security could be. These lessons, learned in silence and routine, stayed with him long after the fields were behind him. Stories like this served another purpose as well. They reassured people that power was not random, that rulers were not merely the strongest or most violent, but chosen by forces older than cities themselves. In times of uncertainty, such beliefs brought comfort. They made authority feel inevitable rather than imposed. And yet, beneath the myth, there is something deeply human. A child without status, a life without promise, a beginning so small it could easily have vanished without record. Great power often begins this way, not announced, not recognized, but quietly surviving when it should not have. Not because the world is fair, but because chance and resilience sometimes align. Sargon's story did not begin with conquest or command. It began with survival, with being overlooked, with growing up unseen. The river carried him away from his past, but it did not define his future. That would come later, shaped not by myth alone, but by choice, ambition, and the moment when opportunity finally met resolve. For now, he remained just a child raised far from thrones, unaware that the world he lived in, divided and restless and endlessly competing, was waiting for someone who did not yet know he would change it forever. Time moved quietly, and the child from the river grew into a man shaped by patience and observation. His path did not rise quickly. It curved slowly, almost unnoticed, until it carried him into the very heart of power. Sargon entered the court of Kish not as a warrior or a noble, but as a servant. He became cupbearer to the king, Uzababa. It was a role that appeared humble, yet required absolute trust. The cupbearer stood close to the throne, closer than generals, closer than priests. He handled what the king consumed. He moved freely through guarded halls. He listened, watched, and remembered. Uzababa ruled Kish in a world that never allowed rest. His crown sat heavy with unease. Rivals pressed at his borders. Alliances shifted without warning. Even within his own court, loyalty felt uncertain. Kings of this age feared those standing near them more than enemies far away. At first, Sargon was simply useful, reliable, silent. His presence steadied the court rather than disturbed it. The king entrusted him with tasks that required discretion, but trust, once given, has a way of inviting doubt. Sargon's competence drew attention. His calm manner stood in sharp contrast to the nervous energy of the palace. He spoke only when necessary and remained silent when others argued. He appeared untouched by ambition, yet ambition often hides behind stillness. Whispers began, faint and uncertain. Servants noticed, priests watched, and the king, whose sleep was already thin, began to dream. The dreams came heavy and disquieting. Urzababa woke drenched in sweat, his heart racing in the dark. In the visions he saw himself falling, pulled downward by a force he could not name, crushed by a presence he could not escape. The symbols blurred when he tried to remember them, but the fear remained sharp and undeniable. He turned to interpreters, to priests trained to read the unseen world. They spoke carefully, measuring every word, yet their meaning was clear enough. A man close to the king would rise. The throne would be shaken, power would shift. Prophecy, once heard, cannot be unheard. Urzababa's gaze changed. What had once seemed harmless now felt dangerous. The cupbearer's silence became suspicious. His steadiness felt unnatural. In a world where rulers fell without warning, fear moved faster than reason. The king did not confront Sargon openly. That would have drawn attention. Instead, he chose a quieter path, one meant to erase the threat without leaving a trace. Sargon was sent on a mission, entrusted with a sealed message and spoken words of confidence. The letter, meant for another ruler, was said to contain instructions for Sargon's death. It was an old method in a dangerous world. The king's hands would remain clean. Fate would do the work. But fate, once again, refused to follow expectation. Whether through chance, insight, or unseen intervention, the plan failed. Sargon lived, and in surviving, something within him shifted. The servant who had once observed quietly now understood the truth of the system he served. Power did not protect loyalty. Trust was conditional. Obedience offered no safety. The realization came slowly, but it did not fade. Sargon returned not as a grateful servant, but as a man awakened. The palace that had once symbolized order now appeared fragile. The king, once distant and commanding, looked afraid. Authority, Sargon saw, was not absolute. It rested on belief, fear, and constant reinforcement. Rebellion did not ignite all at once. It smouldered. Sargon found allies among those already strained by endless conflict. Soldiers tired of fighting for victories that never lasted. Officials frustrated by unstable leadership. People who sensed that the land between the rivers could not continue its cycle of rise and collapse forever. What made Sargon dangerous was not ambition alone, but vision. He did not seek to replace one king with another. He questioned the structure itself, the endless competition, the fragile rule, the belief that power could never endure. When he finally moved against Urzababa, it was not merely a personal betrayal. It was a challenge to the idea that cities must remain divided, that authority must always be temporary. The rebellion spread quickly, not through violence alone, but because the ground was already unstable. Kish had ruled before. It could fall like any other. And when it did, the fall felt different. This was not simply another city changing hands. This was a servant stepping into power, a man without royal blood claiming authority through resolve and action. The old order cracked, and through the opening stepped something unfamiliar. One man had challenged an entire system. and in doing so he set in motion a transformation that would soon move far beyond Kish, beyond tradition, beyond expectation, beyond anything the land between the rivers had ever known. What began in Kish did not remain there. The land between the rivers had seen conquerors before. Cities rose, cities fell, and power shifted like sand beneath the feet of kings. Nothing about conflict was new. Memory itself was shaped by loss and return, by banners raised, torn down, and raised again under different names. Yet Sargon's movement carried a different weight. It did not stop at revenge or replacement. It did not pause after victory to gather praise or tribute. It moved outward with intention, steady, deliberate, and unrelenting, as if guided by a design larger than any single city, larger even than the man himself. The first targets were familiar names: Uruk, Ur, Lagash. These were ancient places, older than memory itself. Their temples had stood for centuries, layered with offerings from generations who believed their walls would never fall. Stone and brick carried the imprint of countless hands. Their gods had received prayers from rulers long turned to dust. Each city wore its age as proof of favour, the certainty that survival itself meant protection. From within those walls the world still felt ordered, but beyond them something new was approaching. Sargon did not come as a raider. He did not strike and withdraw. He did not burn and vanish into the distance. He approached as a force reshaping the balance of the world, patient, prepared, and unwilling to leave anything unfinished. His armies moved with a discipline unfamiliar to the region. Soldiers were no longer gathered for a single season and then dismissed back to their fields. They remained. They trained. They marched together again and again until movement itself became instinct. They answered to a central command rather than local loyalties. Where older wars had been brief and symbolic, these campaigns pressed forward without pause. Uruk was among the first to feel the shock. From its walls, a citizen watched the horizon darken with movement. At first it looked like weather, dust, lifted by wind across the plain. Then the sound arrived, carried ahead of the army itself, a low rhythm, measured, deliberate. Not the scattered noise of a raid, but something unified, almost calm. This was not a force testing strength. This was something heavier, something final. Fear moved faster than the soldiers themselves. Inside the city, priests hurried through temples, their movements quick and unsteady as they adjusted offerings and whispered invocations. Incense burned thicker than usual. Hands trembled as bowls were lifted and set down again. Gates were reinforced. Messages were sent. Families gathered indoors, doors drawn tight, voices lowered. Uruk had fallen before. It had always risen again, but this time felt different. When the fighting came, it didn't explode into chaos. There was no long collapse, no frantic unravelling of order. Instead, the city bent beneath pressure it could not escape. Authority broke not through fire alone, but through certainty. The defenders understood quickly what this war was, and what it was not. Retreat would not bring reprieve. Negotiation would not restore independence. Victory, even if achieved, would not be temporary. This enemy did not come to prove dominance and leave. Sargon did not withdraw after victory. He stayed. For the citizen watching from the streets, confusion followed fear. The walls still stood. The temples still rose above the city, their shadows unchanged by conquest. The familiar rhythms of life returned, slowly, cautiously. Yet the banners had changed. Orders came from unfamiliar voices. Guards answered to distant authority. Decisions arrived already sealed. Uruk remained, but something essential had been taken from it. Not its buildings, not its gods, its future. Word travelled quickly along the rivers and roads. Fell. Lagash followed. Each conquest sent ripples outward across Sumer. Cities that had ruled their neighbours for generations now faced the same fate they once imposed. Kings were defeated not only in battle, but in meaning. The old rituals of victory, processions, offerings, boasts, lost their power. There was no rising again. At the centre of resistance stood Lugalza-Jayzi, ruler of Uruk and self-proclaimed master of Sumer. He had built his power through conquest, uniting many cities beneath his command. To him, Sargon appeared familiar, a challenger shaped by the same world, bound by the same rules. That belief did not survive their meeting. Lugalza-Jayzi was captured and brought low. His defeat was made visible, undeniable. He was displayed before the cities he once commanded, a living declaration that the old order had ended. The humiliation was deliberate. It was not cruelty alone, it was message. The age of rival kings was over. For the first time, the land between the rivers answered to a single ruler. Not temporarily, not symbolically, completely. From the northern plains to the southern marshes, cities that had never bowed to one another now shared the same authority. Their gods were still worshipped. Their traditions endured. Temples remained active. Festivals continued. But political independence vanished. Borders dissolved. Rivalries lost their purpose. Power no longer shifted. It settled. Sargon took a new title, one that reflected the scale of what had occurred. King of the four quarters of the world. It was not modest. It was not cautious. It was absolute. The title declared that power no longer belonged to a city but to a system, that the world itself, at least as it was known, had been gathered into a single structure. For the citizen of Uruk, awe replaced confusion. The city had fallen, yet the world had not ended. Fields were still planted, trade still moved along the rivers, life continued, but belonging felt different now. Identity was no longer tied only to walls and local gods, but to something vast, distant, and unseen. An empire had been born, not by accident, not by tradition, but by design. This was the invention of something new, a power meant to endure beyond a single victory, beyond a single lifetime. A rule enforced not only by strength, but by organization and permanence. And as the dust settled over the fallen cities of Sumer, the realization spread quietly and irresistibly. The old world of endless rivalry was gone. In its place stood something unified, unfamiliar, and immense. The first empire had entered history. Conquest alone could not hold what had been taken. Sargon understood this with a clarity few rulers possessed. The land between the rivers had known conquerors before, men who marched in with force, claimed victory, and withdrew again. Their power depended on presence and fear alone. When armies left, the old order returned. Cities remembered themselves. Independence crept back in, quiet and inevitable, like grass pushing through cracked stone. An empire could not survive that way. Victory, Sargon saw, was not enough. It had to be anchored. It had to remain even when he was absent, even when his voice was not heard, even when time itself pressed forward. So he began to build not just power, but structure. At the centre of this new world he raised a capital. Its name was Akkad. Unlike Ur or Uruk, it was not ancient. It did not rest on layers of myth and memory. It was not bound to centuries of ritual or to the favour of a single god. It was chosen, deliberately, shaped to serve the empire itself. Akkad did not belong to one people. It did not belong to one god. It belonged to authority. From this city, decisions radiated outward. Orders no longer emerged from many thrones competing for influence, but from a single centre. Seals were pressed into clay. Tablets were carried out through gates at dawn. Messengers moved without ceremony, their paths cutting across old borders that no longer mattered. The empire gained a heart, steady and deliberate, beating beyond the reach of any one city's loyalty. Language followed power. The Akkadian tongue, once local and limited, became the speech of administration and command. It was heard in courts, spoken in garrisons, pressed into wet clay by scribes whose hands moved quickly and without hesitation. To govern was to understand it. To rise within the system was to use it. Slowly, the language of the empire replaced the language of the city-state. This was not cultural erasure. Traditions endured, gods were still honoured, festivals still marked the seasons, but authority now spoke with one voice, and that voice travelled farther than any banner ever had. In a provincial city, a scribe bent over a tablet in the early light. He listened as a messenger read out instructions sealed in Akkad. The words were precise, impersonal. They did not ask for agreement. They expected obedience. When the scribe pressed the final mark into clay, he knew the order would outlive the moment, long after the messenger departed, long after the tablet dried and hardened. Power had learned how to remember itself. Sargon replaced old rulers with governors, men chosen not by lineage or local acceptance, but by loyalty. They ruled not because a city trusted them, but because the empire appointed them. Their authority flowed downward from Akkad, not upward from the people they governed. For cities long accustomed to choosing or overthrowing their leaders, this was a profound shift. Authority became distant. Decisions arrived from far away, carried by messengers who knew the seal better than the streets they passed through. A governor might walk a city he did not love, rule a people who did not know him, enforce laws shaped by priorities beyond the horizon. And yet the system held. The army changed as well. No longer a temporary force raised for a single season, it became standing and constant. Soldiers trained year-round, supplies were counted and redistributed, armour was repaired, weapons standardized. Loyalty no longer belonged to clan or city, but to the ruler and the structure that sustained them. For a soldier stationed far from home, this felt unfamiliar. He served beside men from other cities, spoke commands in a shared tongue, marched beneath banners that represented no single place. His duty did not end with harvest season. It extended forward without clear boundary. This army did more than fight wars. It enforced order. Rebellion was no longer a local matter. It was a challenge to the entire structure. Resistance carried heavier consequences, not because punishment was crueler, but because response was inevitable. Where older rulers hesitated, the empire did not. It answered. Along rivers and across plains, roads took shape. Some followed ancient paths. Others were carved deliberately, straightened and widened to carry traffic that never rested. Messengers travelled them relentlessly, sandals worn thin by distance. Tablets and seals moved hand to hand, day after day, night after night. Information moved faster than ever before. For the first time, power could see itself, know where it was strong, where it strained, where attention was needed. Reports arrived in Akkad from cities Sargon had never seen with his own eyes. The empire did not depend on memory alone. It depended on record. Administration became a craft. In a small administrative room near the city gate, a clerk sat cross-legged on the floor, a tablet resting on his knee. His fingers were stained with clay, the lines of his work pressed again and again into wet earth. He did not decide policy. He did not command soldiers. His task was simpler and heavier. He counted grain. He recorded names. He copied instructions sealed in Akkad, careful not to miss a mark. When the tablet dried, it would outlast his voice, his memory, even his life. He paused only once, listening to footsteps outside, then returned to his work. The Empire did not need him to believe in it. It needed him to remember for it. Records were kept, resources were counted, grain measured, labour assigned, tribute organised rather than demanded at random. What had once been improvised became routine. What had once depended on personal judgment became procedure. The Empire no longer relied on Sargon's presence to function. It continued even when he was far away, even when he was absent entirely. This was the true invention. Power, once personal and fragile, became permanent and impersonal. It no longer rested in a single hand, but in a system designed to outlast individual decisions. Loss could be absorbed, challenges adjusted to. Movement continued without pause. For the people living within it, the change brought mixed emotions. Stability replaced chaos. Trade routes grew safer. Travel became more predictable. Borders mattered less. A merchant could move farther with fewer fears. A farmer could expect the same demands year after year. But freedom narrowed. Authority felt distant, present everywhere, yet nowhere familiar. Power no longer argued. It arrived already decided. The world felt larger now, and heavier. Sargon had not merely conquered cities, he had redefined how power existed. The land between the rivers was no longer a collection of rivals, but a machine, carefully assembled, constantly maintained, and as it turned steady and efficient, it carried everyone within it toward a future shaped not by tradition, but by design. The empire no longer depended on strength alone, it depended on structure, and that made it something entirely new. Even the strongest system needs meaning. Sargon had unified cities, languages, and armies, but something deeper still held the empire together. Stone walls could be broken, soldiers could be defeated, administration could fail. What endured longest, what reached furthest, was belief. In the land between the rivers, the gods were never distant. They lived in temples and statues, in wind and flood, in harvest and drought. Every city had grown around its divine protector. People understood the world through faith long before they understood it through law. The gods explained fortune and failure alike. They gave shape to fear, hope, and order. To rule without the gods was to rule without roots. Sargon understood this. He did not attempt to erase the old beliefs. That would have shattered the fragile unity he'd created. Instead, he reshaped them, gently, deliberately. The great gods, Enlil, lord of wind and authority, and Inanna, goddess of power, war, and fertility, were lifted above local deities. Their presence stretched across the empire. Their favour was no longer confined to a single city or shrine. By honouring them publicly and repeatedly, Sargon bound divine authority to imperial rule. He did not yet claim divinity for himself. Instead, he positioned himself as the gods' chosen representative, the one entrusted to maintain order between heaven and earth. His victories were framed not as personal triumphs, but as signs of divine approval. Success became sacred. Expansion became ordained. Temples changed as well. They remained places of worship, but they also became centres of power. Grain filled their storehouses, incense burned before carved figures, scribes pressed records into clay within their walls, priests moved quietly between altar and archive, serving as intermediaries, not only between gods and people, but between empire and city. A conquered city could accept foreign rule if its gods were still honoured. Rituals continued, festivals endured. A priest raised his hands at dawn, his statue received its offering. The rhythm of sacred life remained familiar, even as political authority shifted. Faith softened resistance where force alone could not. For ordinary people, this mattered deeply. A farmer could obey a distant ruler if the gods seemed unchanged. A merchant could trade under imperial law if offerings were still accepted. Belief provided continuity where power disrupted tradition. Slowly, subtly, the empire learned to speak the language of devotion. Sargon appeared in reliefs and inscriptions beside divine symbols. His name travelled with prayers. His authority was woven into sacred narratives. To challenge him was no longer merely rebellion. It became defiance of cosmic order. This was the empire's quiet strength. Power controlled bodies through law and force. Belief shaped minds through meaning and fear. Together, they formed something far stronger than either alone. Yet belief, like power, demanded balance. The gods had always been approached with caution. They required humility and restraint. Kings before Sargon had ruled beneath them, careful not to overstep. Divine favour could raise a ruler high, but it could just as easily be withdrawn. For now, the balance held. The empire stood unified not only by roads and soldiers, but by shared faith guided carefully from the centre. People prayed beneath the same sky, offered sacrifices under the same authority, and learned to see the empire as part of the natural order of the world. But beneath that harmony lay a quiet tension. When belief becomes a tool of power, it binds tightly, but it also grows fragile. If faith falters, obedience follows, and when rulers forget their place beneath the gods, the foundations they rely upon begin to crack. For the moment, the empire endured. Its strength rested not only in what it commanded, but in what people believed it represented, and belief, once shaped, would one day demand its own reckoning. Time, which had carried Sargon from obscurity to dominance, did not slow for empire. Years passed, and the builder of Akkad grew old. His victories lay behind him, fixed in memory and carved into stone. The empire he created still stood, vast, organized and disciplined. But the man at its center now felt the weight of years. The energy that once carried him across battlefields and councils softened into careful movement and long, quiet reflection. At the edges of the empire, unrest stirred. Rebellions rose where authority felt distant. Borderlands tested the reach of imperial control. The system held, but it strained beneath constant pressure. Messages arrived in Akkad bearing reports of resistance, cities that remembered independence, leaders who questioned permanence. Sargon answered as he always had, with resolve. Yet each challenge reminded him of a truth no ruler escapes. Systems may endure, but they are born of people, and people are temporary. Within Akkad, the routines continued. Governors ruled, priests prayed, soldiers marched, tablets were sealed, orders were carried along the roads. Yet something subtle shifted. The rhythm remained, but the centre felt quieter. What had bound everything together had never been structure alone. It had been the presence of the founder himself, the man whose will gave the system its shape. As Sargon's strength faded, the question lingered, unspoken, but unavoidable. Could the empire survive without him? When his death came, it arrived without spectacle. There was no sudden collapse, no great upheaval. Instead, there was stillness, a pause in the movement of power. The man who had once united the world between the rivers was gone, leaving behind something far larger than himself. The empire outlived its creator, but it did so without certainty. For those who'd known only his rule, the loss felt profound. His authority had been unquestioned, his decisions final. Without him the system remained, but it felt hollow, as if its voice had softened. The divine favor once believed to guide his success now seemed distant, harder to read. Mourning spread through the capital, quiet and restrained. Rituals were observed, offerings were made. His name was spoken with reverence. Yet beneath the ceremonies lay unease. Founders do not pass easily into history. They leave behind shadows too large to ignore. The palace still stood, but it felt different without him. At the borders, rivals watched closely. They listened for weakness. They sensed opportunity. The empire had been built by one man's vision and sustained by his presence. Now it faced a test more difficult than conquest: continuity. To endure, it would have to become something truly independent of its origin. What happens when an empire outlives its creator? The question did not demand immediate answers. It settled quietly into the corridors of power, into the cautious decisions of those who followed, into the shared understanding that what had been forged through will alone must now stand on belief, loyalty, and time. The builder was gone. What remained was his creation, strong, vast, and unproven without him. And for the first time since its birth, the empire stood alone. After the death of the builder, the empire did not fall, but it no longer felt whole. The system Sargon created remained intact. Governors still ruled, armies still marched, temples still stood, orders continued to travel along the roads, pressed into clay and carried by messengers who moved with practiced urgency. On the surface, everything appeared unchanged, yet something essential had thinned. Authority continued, but confidence wavered. What had once felt inevitable now required constant effort to maintain. Power still spoke, but it no longer echoed with the same certainty. The empire stood, but it no longer stood effortlessly. Rimush, Sargon's successor, inherited not just a throne, but a burden. He ruled a world that remembered its divisions. Cities that had accepted imperial order under the founder now tested its limits. They listened carefully for hesitation, watched for delay, searched for signs that the center no longer held. Obedience remained, but belief did not come, as easily as it once had. In one southern city, the gates still opened at dawn. Markets still gathered. Priests still raised their voices in prayer. Yet at night, people spoke more quietly. Doors were closed sooner. Names of old rulers, once spoken only in history, returned to conversation, whispered with a mix of nostalgia and defiance. The memory of independence had not disappeared. It had waited. Revolts came quickly. They rose in the south, in old Sumerian cities whose pride had never fully faded. They appeared along distant borders, where distance softened fear and delay weakened response. Each rebellion was small on its own. Together they formed a pattern, a quiet refusal to believe that empire was permanent. Rimush answered with force. Campaign after campaign pushed back resistance. Cities were subdued. Leaders were removed. Garrisons were reinforced. Order was restored again and again. On the surface, the empire held firm. Militarily, Rimush proved capable. The army still obeyed. The road still carried commands from the center, but victories felt different now. They ended unrest without ending doubt. They silenced opposition without creating loyalty. In conquered streets, soldiers remained longer than before. Their presence was heavier, less ceremonial. Authority did not withdraw after victory. It lingered, watchful and tense. Peace no longer felt like relief. It felt enforced. Something was missing. Victories no longer inspired loyalty. They enforced obedience, but did not create belief. People submitted because they had to, not because they felt bound to something greater. Fear replaced faith, and fear is an unstable foundation. When Rimush died, the empire passed to Manishtushu. His reign followed a different tone, but the same rhythm. Where Rimush reacted, Manishtushu endured. He didn't rush to prove himself. He ruled carefully, measuring response against exhaustion. Yet unrest never fully ended. It shifted locations, tested new weaknesses, measured how far imperial attention could stretch before thinning. Each challenge demanded soldiers, resources, and time. The cost of control grew heavier with every passing year. Manishtushu, like his predecessor, won battles, but he did not win hearts. People remembered Sargon not only as a conqueror, but as a figure of destiny. His rise had felt sanctioned by forces beyond human reach. He had appeared when the old world was exhausted, and his success had seemed inevitable. Those who followed lacked that presence. They ruled by inheritance, not inevitability. Their authority felt thinner, more fragile, dependent on repetition rather than belief. The system still existed, but the belief that sustained it weakened. Temples continued to speak of divine order, but their words carried less certainty. Rituals were performed with care yet without conviction. The gods had once seemed aligned with imperial success. Now, constant unrest suggested something had shifted. People began to wonder whether favour had faded, whether the empire was still protected, or merely enduring by habit alone. Force filled the space where faith had once lived. Governors tightened control. Taxes were enforced more harshly. Soldiers remained visible even in times of peace. Patrols lengthened. Authority moved closer, heavier, more intrusive. The empire did not collapse, but it hardened. And with that weight came resentment. People obeyed, but they no longer trusted. They paid tribute, but without pride. They accepted rule, but without attachment. The empire remained present everywhere, yet felt welcome nowhere. The warning signs were subtle, but unmistakable. An empire can survive fear for a time. It cannot thrive on it forever. Without belief, every victory becomes temporary. Every ruler becomes contested. Each generation must spend more effort preserving what the last one merely inherited. Rimush and Manishtushu kept the empire alive through strength alone. They preserved what Sargon had built, but they didn't renew it. They inherited a system designed to endure, yet lacked the symbolic power that had once given it life. The empire moved forward, but unevenly. Beneath its surface, tension accumulated. Quiet, persistent, unresolved. The structure still stood, but its foundations had begun to crack, not from sudden collapse but from constant strain. And somewhere within that strain, the future waited, for a ruler who would attempt to restore not just control, but meaning. One who would reach higher than those before him. One who would change the relationship between power and belief forever. When NARAM-SIN rose to power, the empire stood at a crossroads. It was vast, disciplined, and battle-hardened, yet restless beneath the surface. Rebellions had been contained, but never erased. Authority endured, but belief had thinned. The system Sargon created still functioned. Roads carried orders, governors enforced law, soldiers guarded distant borders. But something intangible had begun to fade. The empire waited. NARAM-SIN didn't hesitate. From the beginning, his rule carried momentum. Where his predecessors reacted, he advanced. Where they defended, he expanded. He possessed a rare clarity of command, an instinct for movement and timing that turned uncertainty into advantage. Armies moved with precision. Campaigns unfolded without pause. Enemies were not merely pushed back. They were absorbed, broken, or erased from the map of resistance. Under NARAM-SIN, the empire reached farther than ever before. Mountains that once marked the edge of influence now lay within imperial reach. Passes long considered barriers opened beneath marching feet. Distant regions sent tribute not out of fear alone, but resignation. The land between the rivers no longer felt like the centre of the world. It felt like its core. For an Akkadian soldier marching beneath his banners, the experience was overwhelming. He rose before dawn to the sound of movement. Leather tightening, metal shifting, boots pressing into dust still cool from night. He marched beside men who spoke differently, prayed differently, came from cities he had never seen. Yet they moved as one. The banner ahead of them did not belong to any single city. It belonged to the empire. Days blurred together. Camp was raised, broken, and raised again. Fires burned low at night, their smoke drifting upward into a sky crowded with unfamiliar stars. The soldier lay on the ground wrapped in his cloak, listening to breathing around him. Dozens of men, strangers once, bound now by movement and command. Far from home, he felt the weight of distance, not fear, not doubt, but the sense that the world he served was larger than anything he could name. Victories came one after another. Rivers were crossed, walls were approached without hesitation. Each success reinforced loyalty. Each campaign deepened the sense that resistance was no longer a question, only a delay. Yet alongside pride lived something quieter. NARAM-SIN was distant, commanding, absolute. His authority did not invite familiarity. He did not explain himself. Orders arrived sealed and final. Expectations were clear and unwavering. To serve him was to serve something immense, something that did not pause to persuade, and most obeyed willingly. As victories accumulated, something began to shift. Not on the battlefield, but in meaning. Earlier kings had ruled beneath the gods. They presented themselves carefully, as chosen servants, powerful yet restrained. Their authority flowed downward from heaven, fragile and conditional, always subject to favour. NARAM-SIN crossed that boundary. At first the change was subtle. His name appeared more frequently in inscriptions. His victories were described with language once reserved for the divine. Symbols grew bolder, images larger, praise more absolute. Then the boundary collapsed. He didn't merely claim favour, he claimed identity. In stone and clay, in words pressed deliberately into permanence, NARAM-SIN declared himself divine. Not chosen by the gods, but one of them. The declaration did not pass loudly. In cities across the empire, officials read the announcement before gathered crowds. Their voices were steady. The words settled slowly. Some lifted their eyes in awe. Some remained silent, uncertain how to respond. Others felt a tightening in the chest, not fear yet, but something close to it. In a temple courtyard, a priest stood motionless as the words were spoken. He had spent his life honouring gods older than memory, beings who judged kings rather than answered to them. When the reading ended, he bowed, not in devotion, in caution. The crown was no longer just a symbol of rule, it became sacred. Images of NARAM-SIN appeared wearing the horned helmet once reserved for gods alone. His figure was carved larger than life, standing above enemies, above cities, above men. His name entered ritual language without distinction, spoken alongside the divine. For some, this felt like fulfillment. The empire was strong. Crops moved safely along guarded routes. Markets filled. Cities prospered beneath order. Enemies fell before imperial armies. The world itself seemed to confirm the claim. For others, something felt quietly unsettled. Faith no longer stood above authority. It merged with it. The empire had never felt more unified, nor more dependent on a single presence. And as NARAM-SIN stood at the height of victory, divine in name, unmatched in force, the space between ruler and world widened, almost imperceptibly, not through fear, through silence, Victories continued, but the sound around them changed. Temples still opened at dawn, yet chants lingered longer, as if searching for something beyond their reach. Offerings were placed with care, but hands hesitated before releasing them. Prayers were spoken more softly, not from doubt, but from uncertainty. The empire moved forward, but it no longer felt watched in the same way. For a time, success quieted doubt. NARAM-SIN's authority stood unmatched. His armies moved where they wished. His name carried awe as much as fear. The empire continued to expand, and victory seemed to answer every question before it could be asked. Yet beneath the movement of power, unease gathered. The gods had rules. They demanded restraint, ritual, and distance. Sacred spaces existed apart from politics and war. Temples were not merely buildings of stone. They were boundaries, places where power paused, where kings lowered their voices. Under NARAM-SIN, those boundaries softened. Ancient customs were set aside when they slowed command. Sacred traditions bent when they conflicted with necessity. Temples that resisted authority found their protection uncertain. In one city, a statue was removed. In another, a priest's voice was silenced. No proclamation explained these acts. They did not need one. No space lay beyond imperial reach. To the system, this was efficiency. To the people, it felt like transgression. In a half-lit shrine, an altar stood prepared, but untouched. Oil lamps burned lower than before. A priest waited, listening, unsure whether the words he'd spoken all his life still belonged to the world as it now was. Whispers moved through streets and fields. Old men spoke quietly of omens not seen since childhood. Mothers spoke less of protection, more of endurance. The belief that had once unified the empire began to thin. If the king was divine, people wondered, why did the world feel unsettled? If heaven approved, why did harmony feel strained? Then the land itself seemed to respond. Harvests weakened, rains faltered, fields hardened beneath the sun. Famine crept into storehouses that had once overflowed. Trade slowed as scarcity replaced abundance. What had first been dismissed as hardship began to feel deliberate. Meaning followed scarcity. People believed the gods were angry, not loudly, not violently, but completely. Belief shifted, and, with it, resistance found justification. Cities that had endured rule through fear now found reason to defy it. Revolts flared not only from ambition, but from desperation and faith. To oppose the empire was no longer just political. It became sacred defiance. NARAM-SIN answered unrest as he always had. With force, armies moved. Resistance was crushed. Order returned on the surface. But each suppression widened the distance between ruler and ruled. Fear enforced obedience, but it did not restore meaning. The empire continued, but it no longer rested easily. The system that once balanced power through belief and structure now leaned too heavily on command alone. And command, without listening, creates isolation. NARAM-SIN stood at the center of affirmation. Praise arrived more often than warning. Victory spoke louder than doubt. Counsel softened until it disappeared entirely. The empire still functioned, but it felt rigid, tense, unable to breathe. Disaster became interpretation. Every failed harvest, every lost caravan, every uprising reinforced the sense that something fundamental had been broken. Heaven felt distant, silent. When rulers stop listening, systems begin to crack, not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, steadily, from within. The empire had not yet fallen, but the harmony that once sustained it was gone. What remained was power moving forward without balance, strong, uncorrected, and increasingly alone beneath a sky that no longer felt forgiving. The fall of an empire is rarely loud. There is no single day when order vanishes, no moment when everyone agrees the end has arrived. More often, collapse comes quietly, carried by ordinary failures that accumulate until strength becomes exhaustion. It moves slowly enough that people adjust to it, learn to live within it, and only later realize how much has been lost. For Akkad, the unraveling began with the land itself. The rivers that had once brought life grew unpredictable. Their rhythms shifted, rains lessened, floods failed to arrive on time or did not arrive at all. Fields that had been generous for generations hardened beneath the sun. The soil cracked. Crops weakened before harvest, their roots shallow and strained. What had sustained cities for centuries now demanded more effort for less return. Drought did not announce itself as disaster. It appeared as scarcity. At first, storehouses emptied sooner than expected. Officials adjusted rations quietly, believing the change temporary, a little less grain distributed, a few days added between deliveries. Prices rose, but only slightly. Families adapted, meals grew smaller, bread thinner. Patience filled the gap where abundance once lived. A little less grain, a little more waiting. But seasons passed, and relief did not come. Hunger settled into routine. Anxiety became familiar. People stopped speaking of shortage as an exception and began treating it as the new order. Children learned not to ask for more. Elders counted stores again and again, hoping numbers might change if measured carefully enough. Trade, once the empire's unseen strength, began to falter. On a road that had once carried caravans without pause, a lone merchant waited beside his donkey. The animal shifted its weight, ribs faintly visible beneath thinning hide. The merchant checked the horizon again, though he already knew what he would see. No guards, no dust rising from distant wheels, no sound of trade returning. He adjusted the straps on his load, lighter than it had ever been, and turned back toward home. The road still stretched ahead of him, straight and wide, but it no longer led anywhere he trusted. Caravans moved more slowly. Animals weakened under lighter loads that still felt heavy. Routes grew unsafe as central control thinned. Garrisons along the road stood undersupplied, uncertain how long they would remain. Regions that had once exchanged surplus now hoarded what little they had. Markets grew quieter. Stalls that once overflowed with grain, cloth and tools stood half empty. Merchants lingered longer, waiting for buyers who did not come. The steady movement of goods that had tied distant provinces together weakened, and with it weakened the sense of shared destiny. A merchant counted fewer coins at the end of each day. A farmer stored less grain after harvest. A household measured survival one season at a time. The empire had grown vast under NARAM-SIN, but expansion carried hidden cost. Distance strained communication. Messages travelled farther, but arrived later. Governors waited longer for instruction, weighing whether to act or to wait. Messengers arrived bearing orders that no longer fit the moment they reached. Soldiers were spread thin, guarding borders that felt increasingly remote. Loyalty faded where presence disappeared. The system that had once moved with precision now lagged beneath its own weight. What had been efficient became delayed. What had been certain became conditional. Authority still existed, but it arrived slowly, inconsistently, and sometimes not at all. Provinces slipped away, not in open rebellion, but in indifference. They stopped sending tribute on time, then they stopped sending it altogether. Orders went unanswered, reports were delayed, shortened, or never written. Local leaders governed quietly, not declaring independence, but living as though the empire no longer reached them. No banners were raised, no proclamations were made. Authority simply faded wherever enforcement could not follow. At the centre, Akkad felt the pressure. Administration struggled to respond. Records grew outdated before they were read. Resources were redirected again and again, always too late, always insufficient. Grain meant for one region was diverted to another, leaving both short. Decisions followed crises instead of preventing them. The army remained formidable, but power without supply is fragile. Soldiers require food as much as command. When rations thin, discipline weakens, patrols shorten, morale erodes quietly. A force designed to project certainty begins to conserve itself, guarding what remains instead of enforcing what has been lost. The empire still existed, but it no longer functioned as one. People felt the change before they fully understood it. Life grew narrower, travel slowed, certainty vanished. The grand vision of unity, once so convincing, once so heavy with promise, felt distant, almost unreal, like a story, remembered from another lifetime. What mattered now was survival, feeding families, protecting homes, enduring another season. Faith, already shaken, offered little comfort. The gods felt silent. Temples still stood, but prayers sounded thinner within them. Rituals continued, but without confidence. The king felt far away, his presence known only through fading inscriptions and distant authority. The system that had once promised order now struggled to provide even stability. Empires rarely fall in one moment. They thin, they fray, they lose their centre long before their walls collapse. Akkad unravelled through exhaustion, environmental, economic, and human. Each failure fed the next. Drought weakened food supplies, hunger disrupted trade, trade collapse strained control, strained control dissolved loyalty. And as the empire loosened its grip, something waited beyond its borders, watching, patient, ready to move when the structure finally gave way. They came from the mountains. For generations, the GUTIAN tribes had lived beyond the reach of empire, in the highlands where Akkadian roads dissolved into stone, wind, and silence. They were known, but rarely feared, scattered, distant, a concern for border patrols rather than kings. But the empire that had once held firm no longer stood whole. As Akkad weakened, the GUTIANs moved. They did not descend as a single army, nor did they announce themselves with banners or proclamations. They came in fragments, small, fast-moving groups, unburdened and restless. Where imperial armies relied on supply lines and command, the GUTIANs relied on speed and hunger. They struck where defences were thinnest, where cities were already strained by scarcity and neglect. Akkadian defences failed not because they lacked strength. They failed because they lacked cohesion. Garrisons stood isolated. Messengers arrived too late, breathless and unheard. Orders conflicted or never came at all. Soldiers waited for instruction that did not arrive. The system that once responded instantly now hesitated, and hesitation invited disaster. Cities burned, not always completely, but enough to erase order. A breached gate, a looted storehouse, a temple left broken and silent. What little stability remained collapsed beneath sudden violence. The GUTIAN storm did not conquer land in the old sense, it disrupted it. For ordinary people, chaos replaced routine. Families fled streets they had known all their lives. Markets emptied overnight. Authority dissolved into rumour and fear. No one knew who ruled anymore, or whether anyone did. The empire that had once spoken with one voice fell silent. At the centre, Akkad struggled to respond. Central authority still existed in name but not in function. Governors acted independently. Some fled, some negotiated, some tried to rule alone. The roads that once carried seals and commands now carried refugees and panic. The empire was under siege not only from invaders, but from its own unravelling. The GUTIANs did not need to defeat Akkad in open battle. They needed only to keep moving, keep breaking, keep unsettling. Every strike deepened the sense that order was gone for good. Faith offered no refuge. The gods, once believed to guard cities, felt absent. Priests struggled for answers. Ritual sounded hollow against hunger, smoke, and fear. The sacred order that had once anchored life provided no protection now. The army, the backbone of empire, fractured. Units dissolved. Loyalty narrowed to survival. Soldiers became refugees, mercenaries, or simply vanished into the countryside. The standing force that had enforced unity no longer existed as a whole. What remained of Akkadian authority retreated inward, shrinking under pressure from all sides. The centre could not hold, because there was no longer a centre to hold from. The GUTIAN storm did not last forever, but it did not need to. By the time it passed, the empire it struck was already gone. Akkad had been an invention, carefully built, deliberately maintained. Once broken, it did not repair itself. Without structure, belief, and supply, there was nothing left to command. The first empire did not fall with a single defeat. It fell into chaos. And from that chaos, a new world would emerge, quieter, poorer, and deeply aware of what had been lost. The end did not come with ceremony. There was no final proclamation, no single battle remembered above all others. Instead, the empire thinned, quietly, gradually, until it could no longer be recognized as itself. Names of later rulers appeared briefly, then vanished. Their reigns passed without weight, without stories strong enough to endure. The line of Akkadian kings faded into obscurity. What power remained was local, temporary, and uncertain. Authority no longer flowed outward from a centre, it scattered. Each region struggled to govern itself, drawing on fragments of a system that no longer functioned as a whole. And at the heart of it all, the capital disappeared. Akkad, once the engine of empire, slipped into silence. Its streets emptied, its storehouses stood abandoned, records ceased, messengers stopped arriving. The city that had never belonged to tradition now belonged to nothing at all. Time erased it carefully. An old survivor walked through what remained. He had lived long enough to remember order, roads busy with messengers, tablets carried from office to office, soldiers standing watch at every gate. Now his footsteps echoed through empty streets. Walls cracked and leaned. Roofs sagged inward. Weeds pushed patiently through stone. The air felt heavier, not with smoke, but with absence. He paused where officials once gathered, where seals once pressed wet clay, where decisions had shaped the world between the rivers. Broken tablets lay scattered at his feet, their marks unreadable, their purpose forgotten. The empire had spoken from this place once. Now it said nothing. The collapse of administration was complete. No taxes were collected. No laws were enforced beyond local custom. The roads that had once carried authority lay silent. Records that had bound provinces together rotted where they had fallen. Without coordination, trade failed entirely. Cities turned inward, focused only on survival. What had once seemed permanent proved fragile. The old man remembered when Akkad felt eternal, when its authority reached everywhere, when its order felt unbreakable. People had believed the world had finally found stability. That belief had sustained them through conquest, fear, and loss alike. Now, belief was gone. The gods felt distant. Kings felt irrelevant. What remained was the quiet work of enduring another day. The world's first empire had ended, not in fire alone, but in forgetting. Its fall did not shatter the land in a single moment. It left it hollow, emptied of ambition, stripped of unity, reduced to scattered lives moving among ruins that no longer made sense. For the survivor, grief was not dramatic. It was heavy and slow, the weight of knowing that something immense had passed and that nothing would replace it soon. The streets of Akkad led nowhere now, and as the old man turned away, leaving the city behind, the truth settled in fully. The world's first empire was over, not defeated by a single enemy, but undone by time, strain, and the quiet collapse of belief. What remained was silence, and the long shadow of what had once been imagined possible. After the empire ended, the land did not heal quickly. There was no moment when people gathered and agreed that a new age had begun. No announcement marked the shift. No line separated before from after. Instead, the change arrived like dusk. Soft, gradual, and unavoidable. Roads that once carried messengers and soldiers grew quiet. River traffic thinned. The steady hum of imperial order faded until it became difficult to remember what it had ever sounded like. Across Mesopotamia, silence settled. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of things no longer connected. Cities still stood, their walls casting the same long shadows at sunset, but they stood more alone. Fields still produced, but less predictably. Canals were maintained unevenly. Life continued, yet it narrowed, turning inward, choosing what was close and dependable over what had once been vast and far-reaching. The world shrank. This was the beginning of what later generations would call a dark age. Not because the sun stopped rising over the rivers, and not because people vanished entirely, but because memory began to break apart. When order collapses, record-keeping becomes a luxury. When survival becomes the focus, the future grows shorter. People think less about what comes next, and more about what must be endured. Writing declined first. In the years of empire, clay tablets had been everywhere. Scribes pressed symbols into wet clay, recording deliveries of grain, lists of workers, taxes, judgments, and decrees. Words travelled the same roads as armies, binding distant places together through shared orders and shared understanding. Writing had been the empire's quiet voice, steady, constant, and precise. Now those tablets became rare. Without a powerful centre to demand reports, there was no constant reason to write. Storehouses grew smaller, offices fell quiet, courts became local and informal. The scribble schools that had once trained new hands and careful minds lost support. A young apprentice might still learn the signs, but fewer people needed them. Knowledge that had been deliberately preserved became scattered. Literacy did not disappear. It retreated, like a river pulling back from dry ground, leaving only narrow channels behind. In a quiet room once filled with students, an old scribe sat alone. His tools lay beside him, carefully arranged out of habit. No voices recited signs, no fresh clay waited to be pressed. He traced familiar symbols in the dust, not to record anything useful, but to remember that they had once mattered. Trade collapsed alongside writing. The empire had been held together by movement. Boats on the rivers, caravans crossing open plains, exchange between regions that depended on one another. Grain flowed one way, timber another, stone, metals, textiles, all moved along routes protected by imperial presence. When the system failed, those connections frayed. A village that once traded surplus grain for tools could no longer rely. on distant markets. A city that once imported timber and stone accepted whatever could be found nearby. Goods that had once travelled far now stopped short, turned back by risk and uncertainty. Routes grew uncertain. With fewer soldiers on the roads, travel carried greater danger. With fewer goods to offer, merchants stayed home. Over time, the web of trade that had once made Mesopotamia feel like a single living body broke apart into smaller, separate pieces. Each region learned again how to stand alone. Cities began to empty, not in sudden flight, but through quiet decisions made one household at a time. When famine threatened, when walls no longer promised protection, people drifted toward places where food was more likely, closer to irrigated fields, closer to canals, closer to survival itself. Great urban centres, once crowded with noise and ceremony, grew thinner, quieter, unsure of their purpose. Markets opened less often. Stalls stood vacant. Streets echoed longer. Buildings, built for crowds, now sheltered only a few. The rhythm of city life slowed until it no longer set the pace of the world around it. Temples still rose above the streets, but offerings diminished. Priests continued their rituals, but fewer people came. Incense burned less frequently. Songs were sung more softly. Some sanctuaries slipped into neglect, not from disrespect, but from exhaustion. When life becomes fragile, faith often grows quieter too. Not gone, but carried privately, spoken softly rather than proclaimed. In the countryside, the world felt older again. Families measured time by seasons, not by royal decree. Children grew up hearing fewer stories of distant kings and more stories of local hardship. Authority was no longer something abstract and far away. It was whoever controlled water, land, and food. The grand idea of empire, one ruler, one system, one authority reaching everywhere, began to feel imagined, like something belonging to another kind of world. Greatness leaves silence behind. The ruins of Akkadian order did not vanish overnight. Pieces remained, a broken seal pressed into dust, a fragment of inscription half buried by sand, a road still cutting straight through the earth, even though no one remembered who had ordered it built. But without the system that once gave them meaning, they became relics without context. And yet, even in this quiet, not everything was lost. What had been built into the land, habits of administration, memories of unity, the understanding the vast order was possible, did not disappear. It sank beneath the surface, waiting. People no longer lived inside empire, but they remembered that such a thing had once existed. The Dark Age was not an ending. It was a pause, a long breath after strain and collapse. The river still flowed. The soil still waited for seed. And beneath the silence, history gathered itself, slowly, patiently, preparing for the next rise. Time passed, and the ruins of Akkad sank deeper into the earth. Wind carried sand across broken walls. Rivers shifted their courses. The capital of the First Empire disappeared so completely that even its location would later be debated. To the eye, it seemed as though Akkad had left nothing behind. But empires do not vanish the way cities do. They leave patterns. Long after silence settled across Mesopotamia, the Akkadian language continued to live. It survived not because of loyalty, but because it functioned. It had become the language of record, administration, and authority. Even as local dialects returned to daily life, Akkadian endured in formal spaces, shaping communication between regions that no longer shared rulers. Words outlived walls. Scribes who still knew the language carried it forward, teaching it to generations who had never seen Akkad itself. In this way, the empire remained present, quietly, within clay tablets, seals, and official memory. More enduring than language was the model Akkad created. Before Sargon, rule meant dominance over a city. After Akkad, rule meant control of systems. Later kingdoms did not need to invent this idea. They inherited it. When Babylonia rose, it didn't merely conquer, it administered. Territory was organized. Officials were appointed. Records were kept. Power became something maintained, not just claimed. Assyria would go even further. It refined imperial control into discipline and efficiency, expanding authority across greater distances with greater force. Yet beneath its reputation lay familiar foundations: governors appointed from the centre, standing armies, controlled roads, centralized command. These were not Assyrian inventions, they were echoes of Akkad. Imperial administration survived because it solved a problem no city-state could. It allowed diversity without fragmentation. Different peoples, gods, and traditions could exist beneath a single authority so long as the system held. Akkad proved this was possible, even as it revealed how fragile that balance could be. Empire became an idea, not a place, not a dynasty, but a concept. One ruler, many lands, one system, many peoples. It promised order where chaos had ruled, stability where rivalry had exhausted generations. It also carried a warning: power without restraint invites collapse. Every empire that followed carried both lessons. They adopted the structures, the roads, the administration, the language of authority. They also faced the same dangers: overexpansion, loss of belief, distance between ruler and ruled. Some endured longer, some fell sooner. None escape the pattern entirely. Empires die. Systems endure. Akkad's greatest legacy was not its conquests nor its kings, but its imagination. It showed the world what organized power could achieve and what it could destroy. It proved that human ambition could reshape vast spaces and that such reshaping demanded constant care. The land between the rivers would rise again and again. Each time rulers would look back, sometimes consciously, sometimes unknowingly, toward the first empire. They would borrow its tools, repeat its mistakes, and build upon its foundations. Akkad was gone, but the shadow it cast stretched far beyond its lifetime, reaching into every empire that followed, reminding history that even the quietest ruins can shape the future. Akkad is gone. Its walls have vanished. Its streets lie buried beneath shifting earth. The voices that once carried commands across the land between the rivers have long since fallen silent. No traveller can stand within its gates. No map can point with certainty to its centre. And yet, Akkad was never truly lost, because what it created did not depend on stone. The first empire altered the direction of history by proving that power could be organized beyond the scale of a single city, a single god, or a single lifetime. It showed that ambition could stretch across cultures, languages, and landscapes, and bind them, however briefly, into one system. Every empire that followed lived in Akkad's shadow. Some remembered it clearly, studying its methods through preserved language and inherited administration. Others echoed it without knowing its name, rediscovering the same structures when faced with the same problems of scale and control, whether in Mesopotamia, along the Nile, across the Mediterranean, or far beyond. Rulers returned again and again to the same solution: central authority, appointed officials, standing armies, roads, law, belief shaped to serve order. From Akkad to Rome, the pattern repeated, not as imitation, but as consequence. Once the idea of empire entered the world, it could not be undone. It became a tool available to those willing to wield it, and a temptation difficult to resist. Empire promised stability where chaos had reigned. It promised peace through dominance, unity through force, prosperity through order. At its best, it reduced endless war. It connected distant peoples. It allowed culture and trade to move where borders once stood. At its worst, it demanded obedience without consent. It silenced difference. It strained land and people alike until collapse followed. Akkad carried both truths. It rose through vision and discipline. It fell through imbalance and overreach. Its story is not one of simple failure, nor of pure triumph. It is a warning written into the foundations of history, that power can endure only when belief and restraint endure with it. The shadow of the first empire is long, not because it lasted forever, but because it taught humanity what was possible and what was dangerous. Every empire that followed stepped into that shadow, hoping to claim the strength without repeating the cost. Some learned, some did not. Akkad reminds history that systems may outlive individuals, but never consequences. That organization can shape the world, but cannot escape the limits of land, belief, and human nature. Before Akkad, power was personal and fleeting. After Akkad, it became structural and expansive. The rivers still flow where the empire once stood. The soil still remembers its weight. And though Akkad's name fades into legend, its influence remains, embedded in the rise and fall of every great power that came after. Before Akkad, there were kings. After Akkad, there were empires.